Okay, up next we have Chapter 19, where we'll be covering transport operations. As EMRs, part of your competencies per the National EMS Education Standard, you must acquire a basic knowledge of operational and roles and responsibilities to ensure your safety, the safety of your partners, bystanders, and, of course, the patient or the victim. Understand the risks and responsibilities of operating an emergency vehicle in non-emergency and emergency response. The biggest take home for that is to always operate with due regard. In North Carolina, for fire apparatus, ambulances, QRVs, or even some personally owned vehicles responding to an emergency scene, there are no speed limitations during that instance, as long as the vehicle is being operated within due regard. So just because we don't have a set speed limit that we have to travel to, it can be easily determined in the event of an accident or an incident that if you were driving too fast for conditions, you would be held liable for that. Like rainy conditions, foggy, icy, things like that, that your excessive speed for those conditions causes you to wreck or something like that, could turn around and hold you liable. So we have to be aware and comfortable with those situations and driving with due regard. And then also understanding air medical aspects, safe air medical operations, when to and when not to fly or request a helicopter to fly. And then the criteria for using these air medical services. How do we land them? Where do we land? How do we set up that LZ? Things like that. Does the patient qualify for a helicopter? Around here, we don't typically use fixed wing transports for emergency settings. We have the luxury of having a lot of hospitals within close proximity to us. So typically, airlift is the most common use. So to be an effective EMR or emergency medical responder, you need to prepare for the call and always be prepared for that call. When you receive a dispatch, review the information, make sure that you're familiar with it and you understand what you are theoretically responding to. Keeping in mind that dispatch information is not always accurate, though that not be intentional all the time or shouldn't be intentional. Sometimes there is miscommunication and we don't actually get the accurate information up front. And then we arrive on scene to a stub toe, and we walk in the door and we find out somebody's been shot in the chest. So respond to the scene safely, drive with due regard, always watch for other drivers and other vehicles, obstacles, obstructions, things like that. And then when you get on scene, even before you get out of your vehicle, whether it be a fire truck, ambulance, rescue truck, personal vehicle, always do a scene size up, windshield survey. Even if it's at a residence or apartment building, it doesn't have to be just the site of an accident. Always kind of get a general feel of what your scene looks like. Is this a shady neighborhood? Is this some place that might have somebody that doesn't want you there at all? Things of that nature. What kind of terrain features are there that might pose a threat to you or other additional responders? And then when you make patient contact, perform your initial patient assessment and provide the necessary emergency care. If there's immediate life threats, address those first. So sometimes we have to bypass our vital signs because we see an immediate life threat like major hemorrhaging or like we've discussed in other chapters already, the patient's not breathing, things of that nature. And then, of course, if you are the first unit to arrive on scene, update your additional responding units or personnel. And then, of course, as always, complete your post-run activities, whatever those may be. Sometimes it's simply packing your bag back up, throwing it back in the back seat of your car. Other times it might involve decontamination and then restocking. So preparing for the call, when you respond using a fire department vehicle, a law enforcement vehicle, or your private vehicle, or even on foot, you must ensure that all these vehicles or your backpack are ready to respond at all times. It doesn't do you any good or the patient any good to show up on scene and realize, like, I forgot to restock my face mask or my ventilation mask, or I forgot to put a tourniquet back in my bag, and that person has an arterial bleed from a chainsaw or something like that. So follow a regular schedule to inspect and maintain all of your vehicles, in particular your department vehicles. But if you are responding in your personally owned vehicle, it is good to make sure that it is kept in service or regularly serviced and have that preventative maintenance. You want to do things like check your tire pressure, fuel levels, fluid levels. Make sure you don't run out of gas when you're on your way to a call or while you're sitting at a call. I personally, one time, actually twice now, have had my vehicle overheat while I left it sitting on the side of the road responding to calls because something mechanically happened. One time a thermostat had gone out, and then another time my cooling fans, which are electric, they had turned off and the vehicle overheated both times. Fortunately, I was able to catch it before it did any damage. Be prepared to respond promptly using the most direct route available. This is kind of a key thing too. Using the most direct route possible or available within safety. We don't want to give the appearance of lollygagging or taking our time. If we take an extended route because it's more comfortable for us while we're responding to a call, that can raise some eyebrows and some questions. And make sure you have the proper equipment to complete the job that you are responding to. So some of these things, for example, your patient examination equipment or your diagnostic equipment, your PPE, bandaging and dressing equipment, patient immobilization equipment, extrication equipment if that's what you're geared up for. And this equipment needs to be stocked and maintained on a regular basis according to the schedule specified by the agency. Now, of course, this kind of excludes your personally owned vehicle. There's really no expectation of what kind of equipment you have in your personal vehicle. That's more of personal preference. Unless, of course, your department actually has a list saying, like, in your jump bag, you must carry ABCD. So that is also something that you may want to find out from your department. It's like, hey, look, apart from ABCD, is there anything else that I am required to have when I'm responding POV or personally owned vehicle? So down here you've got just a picture on the bottom right-hand screen of your slide of like an example of a basic BLS first aid type kit. Some of those things in there you may not even want to have. Some you may want to have extras of. And a lot of it, when it's your personal stuff, you might want to gear that more to your personal tendencies or preferences. And then, of course, if it's an agency's equipment bag, you need to keep those adhered to their checkoff sheets. Next slide, we have a couple examples of some suggested contents for an emergency medical responder life support kit. I'll give you just a second to kind of skim through those. When they say flashlight there at the top left corner, I'll point to it. They're really kind of meaning more of an eye examination flashlight, the little pen light for checking pupils. And remember, these are suggestions, so it may or vary from different department to different department. But 5 pairs of gloves, face masks, a bottle of hand sanitizer, eye protection, disposable gown, when we're talking about PPE, resuscitation equipment, the oral airways. And remember, we discussed in our medical emergencies, or I think our poisoning chapter, about the difference between oral airways and nasal airways. And for EMRs, typically an oral airway is kind of the go-to. Nasal airways aren't necessarily always there and applicable. So whatever your department uses. And then, of course, you have your hemorrhage control and wound dressings, patient immobilization, extrication equipment. It says, spring-loaded center punch. Doesn't necessarily have to be a spring-loaded center punch. My trauma shears, and actually one of my pocket knives has a punch on it that works just as effectively as a spring-loaded one. The biggest disadvantage to those is you really want to make sure that you've got protection on your arm so that when you're swinging your arm and hitting that glass, you don't actually go through the glass and cut your arm. Miscellaneous equipment, these are kind of more optional, but they're preferred. Some, blankets, cold packs, Obviously, bandage scissors or trauma shears, those are kind of more of a necessity. They are multi-use items or tools that you probably want to have at least one or two pairs in different locations. On the scenes of wrecks or acute trauma patients or cardiac arrest, those kind of seem to be those mythical items that everyone's asking everybody else, hey, do you have a pair of trauma shears? And nobody really ever seems to have a pair. So there's a lot of grasping and reaching around for those. And then, optional equipment, you've got oral glucose. Those are great. And then Narcan, the intranasal spray. Those are great items to have in your kit as well if your department or your medical control allows you to have that as an emergency medical responder. The phases of just an emergency call. This is the same for emergency medical responders to EMTs, advanced EMTs, paramedics, firefighters, law enforcement. So you receive your dispatch. Your comm center or dispatch facility is the center that receives your 911 calls when someone in need of help or reporting an incident calls them. And most centers are a part of a 911 system. The dispatchers are often nowadays, and even more and more as time goes on or is progressing, is becoming a E911 dispatching system where they have a set of drop-down boxes or algorithms of questions that they ask, and they can categorize or classify types of calls based on the information they receive. And they can kind of emergency medical dispatch for a lot of these calls. But anyway, they should obtain the proper information from the caller and instruct callers on how to perform life-saving techniques such as CPR or major hemorrhage control if need be. You may receive the dispatch, depending on your agency, by telephone, radio, pager, computer terminal, or even a written printout. I'm not really sure where that happens in the U.S. anymore. But predominantly for me, for example, for several of my agencies, our cell phone, that's our primary dispatch. And actually I have a active 911 alert on there right now. I'm not sure who that's for, which agency, but that is one of our primary sources of dispatching and kind of like a preliminary CAD type system. We also have Raiders. We have pagers that page out that we receive our dispatch comments on. And then we also have apps or links to our actual CAD system where we can get our continuously updated notes. And that's kind of the standard go-to here in the United States anyways, and in Western North Carolina. But some of the things that the dispatchers should be asking is what's the nature of the call, the name and location of the patient, a callback number. That's usually one of the first things that they get actually nowadays. How many patients are there? And are there any special problems or specifics about that emergency? And then, of course, on this list, it has the callback numbers on the bottom. Probably should actually be, name and location and number, and then the nature of the call should actually be how it progresses. But it varies from agency to agency. So responding to the scene, you want to get there quickly and safely, driving with due regard. Remember, just because we have lights and sirens and our vehicles are brightly colored, people don't see us. People get zoned into their own driving. They have the earbuds nowadays. They can't hear you. If you pay special attention when you're driving emergency traffic, you'll notice that a lot of times if you're traveling at higher rates of speed, you can almost outrun your siren. So the noise that your siren is projecting out in front of your vehicle really isn't traveling that far. And then you take into consideration the vehicles in front of you. They have their driver is encapsulated within that vehicle. There's the noise of their radio, the noise of the road underneath the car, the noise of the car itself, and it really just muffles that noise out. And a lot of times people cannot even hear you until you're almost about to pass them. So a lot of times when we overtake a slower moving vehicle from behind, when we pass, we're actually surprising these people. A lot of times, we'll kind of mistake it as like they're not getting out of my way, or they're just making it difficult. And really, in reality, sometimes they just don't know we're there. So when we're approaching a vehicle from behind, slow down, give them time to see you, maybe position yourself a little bit to the left or to the right to where they might be able to see you in their mirror a little bit better. If we get too close up behind a vehicle, especially box trucks, we put ourselves into their blind spot, and then that box itself acts as additional insulation. So now they can't see us, and they can't hear us. And then if we go to make a move to pass them, we catch them out of their peripherals, they freak out, and they might do something that inadvertently causes an accident. Another aspect to responding to the calls is make sure you know where you're going before you go. I'm personally guilty of this, and I still do it to this day. I'll get in the truck, we'll hear like kind of a general idea of where we're going or direction, and start heading down the road. And then once we get going, unless you have a CAD system that brings up an active mapping system automatically for you, you realize you're racing down the road and you don't really actually know where you're going, or the specific address. So you get in the truck, you check en route, your partner can be punching in an address or what have you on a GPS system, or looking at maps or whatever your mapping system is while you're getting underway. But if you don't 100% know exactly, we're coming out of the station, we're turning left, we're going 0.2 of a mile, we're turning right, just wait 30 seconds, find out exactly where you're going. Let your partner, who's supposed to be navigating for you, let them kind of tell you, go ahead and get prepared to tell you which way to go. I personally do like to have a visual reference on the map, especially if it's like a moving GPS map or something like that, to where I can see it as well as my partner. So my partner can give me pre-turn instructions, or like, okay, we're going to have an S curve coming up, you might want to slow down, things like that, or we're going to be turning right onto thus and such road. But I also like to kind of see that map myself, so I can kind of give myself cues on when to start slowing down or when I can speed up, things like that. So that way we're not at the last minute just locking on the brakes to avoid missing a turn. Safety procedures, be certain that all personnel are properly seated and secured with approved seat belts, and this includes during transport of a patient. The attendants, oftentimes because of the necessity of our jobs, we are unsecured in the back of an ambulance. We're moving around, we're performing patient care. We're going from these cabinets up here to these cabinets back here, things like that. But when at all possible, those attendants do need to be seated and secured. We also, when we are driving, we have to be aware that these people are unsecured, and we need to drive extra cautiously when possible. It's a very unstable situation or environment back there, so driving what we perceive as a normal driving habit is actually very rough for the people in the back of the ambulance, and it makes it very difficult for them to maintain balance. And then in that same light, keeping our equipment secure. A lot of ambulances carry these $30,000 cardiac monitors that need to be secured for a couple reasons. $30,000 is a lot of money, but if we get rear-ended or T-boned or run off the road and rolls, things like that, now you've got this 15, 20-pound item that is now a projectile. And any other kind of equipment caddies or other pieces, ventilators or other pieces of equipment, they need to be secured, and the cabinets need to be kept closed when we're not actively retrieving things out of them, to prevent that projectile or just clutter falling and things like that. So using your vehicle warning system. So in North Carolina, for personally owned vehicles, all except for chiefs of departments, you cannot have a siren. South Carolina, it's actually the law that if your vehicle has, even if you're a volunteer, if your vehicle has a light, it has to be 360 degrees of visual reference. So you need to have lights on the front, the rear, and both sides of your vehicle. And you also have to have a siren that's no less than 150 watts. And it has to be used. If you are responding emergency traffic to a call, it's all or nothing. There is no, let's just run just lights, to kind of be a little bit quiet, but let people know I'm trying to get somewhere fast. It's all or nothing. Whereas North Carolina, also in South Carolina, you have the red and white forward facing, and then to the 50% of your vehicle, and then of the front half, and then the rear half, it turns into red and yellow, rear facing. North Carolina, technically the law only mentions a single forward facing red light for volunteers. That's kind of a laxer law. You see a lot of personally owned volunteer vehicles that are very well lit, and some of them are actually lit better than a fire truck. But unless you are a chief officer of a department, you still can only operate lights. And then it's also, depending on your agency policies, and then your county policies, as well as like what type of calls you can run lights to and whatnot. So be familiar with your SOGs and your standard operating procedures for your department and for your county. Different agencies or systems have rules mandating the use of lights and sirens for the type of response that they're going for their fire departments and their ambulances. So we need to be aware of those as well. And remember, when you're using your emergency warning system in your vehicle, whether it be a fire truck, police car, ambulance, or a personally owned, we're simply requesting the right of way, and citizens or bystanders, they have no obligation whatsoever to actually get out of your way. The only law in North Carolina that mandates that is that if you are stopped on the side of the road, they have to move over and give you room, or they have to at least slow down if they're incapable of moving over. But they have no obligation to yield to you coming through. So try to keep that in mind as well. When we get angry with people for not getting out of our way, true, they're not really being very cordial to us, but they're also not required to do it. And then, of course, try not to exceed a safe speed for the vehicle you are operating. Know the vehicle that you're operating, know its limitations. So practicing driving, going out on a driving course, things like that, kind of being familiar to what its safe, comfortable operational speeds are. And then drive defensively all the time. As soon as we start driving offensively, that's when we get into accidents. So we arrive on scene. We want to place our vehicle in a safe location. Sometimes that is actually using our vehicle as a protective barrier from other traffic, oncoming traffic. So if you arrive, even if it's your personally owned vehicle, and you arrive onto an accident, a motor vehicle accident first, you might want to park a little ways down away from it. Park your vehicle at an angle facing so that if another vehicle comes and hits you, it will deflect that force away from you and the accident scene. You might lose your vehicle, but it's better than you or your patient's lives. Consider how best to use your vehicle warning lights, how to position your vehicle so that they can most visually alert people coming from down the way, and perform a good scene size up. Look for hazards, downed electrical lines, and unless you're an electrician or a technician working for a power company, you see a line down, don't try to determine whether it's a cable line, phone line, or power line, or even a guide wire, because you don't know. There's really no way for us to know without the proper equipment to know if that line is actually being arced somewhere down the line up on a pole. Guide wires can be crossed, and they can actually be hot. So downed electrical lines, treat every single line as if it is a live line. Leaking fuel or other leaking fluids, broken glass, or even fire. A lot of times, engine oil, antifreeze, things like that can cause slipping hazards as well. And then control the flow of traffic to determine or to ensure scene safety for the rescuers, the patients, and other bystanders. Bystanders, it's always a good idea to kind of have them corral them off to the side to a centralized or a designated area so we can keep track of them. Determine how many patients you have. Identify whether you need additional resources. Is this going to be a single patient, or is this going to be a mass casualty? Do you need to activate a trauma system or a mass casualty? Provide patient care using the knowledge and skills that you've learned, addressing the immediate life threats as you find them first, and then continuing on with your patient assessment and treatment plan. So transferring patient care to other EMS personnel, give them a brief report of the situation that you initially observed, your interventions, and then the response to your interventions. If you can give them a little written report, that's great. If not, try to make sure that they're actually paying attention to you when you give that report. If you just say it, standing back over here behind my shoulder while I'm focused on, this avulsion or something like that, and I'm kind of focused in on this injury, I may not hear everything that you just told me. So try to make sure that you can get that direct contact and attention from the EMS personnel you're handing off to. And then when your job is done, complete your paperwork. Actually, it's not done until your paperwork's complete. A lot of different departments or agencies have timelines where you have to have your call report done. So, a lot of them, the standard go-to is within 24 hours. Some departments have a shorter time frame, provided that you don't get dispatched to an additional call. You have to have your call done within, I know one agency says within an hour after clearing up from that call, unless an additional call comes in. Others just have that standard, 24 hours or before you go home. So you don't get to go home unless all your charts are done or your reports are done. So even after the end of shift, you still have to do charting. And then there are exceptions to that. Your supervisor or your shift lieutenant or somebody might be able to give you a temporary stay or leave to allow you to go home if you've been exceptionally busy. And that's really just dependent on the departments. For the state of North Carolina, there are set standards. You have to have that call report done within that 24 hours for EMS providers. So definitely make sure that you get that information from your agency before proceeding on and doing charts. Make sure that your equipment is clean and ready, neat and tidy, well put away, and your bag is restocked for the next call. You could receive an additional dispatch for another call while you're still on this first call. So as soon as possible, or as soon as you're able to, get your kit, your equipment put back up to the appropriate location, stowed away appropriately, restocked, and ready for that next service. If it involves something like decontamination or major restocking, let dispatch know that's what has to be done, and that you're not able to go back in service until that is done. And this is typically kind of more reserved towards the duty crews or the duty vehicles. So your rescue trucks, fire trucks, and ambulances, those are the time when you're going to delay returning to service because of decontamination or restocking. Personally owned vehicles, ideally that's not your primary response unit. So you don't really have, unless your agency has a policy about it, you don't really have to worry about saying, hey, my radio number, I'm going to be out of service for decontamination until blah, 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 something like that. That's not really necessary. But if you're on ambulance, 17 or medic 17, what have you, and you have to be out of service for that decontamination, that's the appropriate time to notify dispatch. So let's talk about a little bit more funner things. We have helicopters. We have several helicopters within a close vicinity or proximity to our vicinity in western North Carolina. They are used to reach patients in difficult places or difficult terrain. They are used to expedite transport of high acuity patients from outlying areas to the appropriate medical facility. And then they are also used to remove patients from otherwise inaccessible areas to a more accessible area, whether that be whether that be a simple airlift from point A to point B to an awaiting ambulance or to an additional air flight medical unit. So here we have pictured Mama, I think that's Mama 1. That's the newest addition to the Mountain Area Medical Airlift team. The Mama system, the Mountain Area Medical Airlift system, has operated two EC-135 airframes for the past number of years, and just recently has added a third additional, newer, it's a EC-145E airframe to their fleet, or that's within this past year, I believe. So they now have 3 operational medical ambulances, air medical ambulances in this area. And then down here in the center bottom of your screen, you see an example of a UH-60, better known as a Black Hawk. This is part of the North Carolina Heart team. There's a heart team in South Carolina that also responds to portions of western North Carolina down by the state line when specially requested, when the North Carolina heart team cannot respond. But this is the largest airframe that the heart team uses, and this is typically used in a point A to point B airlift of patient transports. Sometimes they do short hauls where the patient actually stays suspended underneath the helicopter. Other times they actually bring them up inside the aircraft, bring them over, land, and then they transfer them to a ground transport unit or to another airlift medical helicopter that can actually land on a helicopter pad at a hospital. The Blackhawks are far too large to land at most hospitals in this area, especially on the pads. Sometimes in certain situations they can land in a parking lot or in a field next to them, but they are not advanced life support equipped. So if a person does require air transport, they do need to be transferred onto a helicopter like Mama, or you also have Life Flight, Regional One, MedTrans, helicopters like that actually have a nurse and a paramedic and the appropriate equipment on board them for the advanced life support. So helicopters do have several advantages. They can respond quickly above traffic congestion or into wilderness areas like we have a plethora of around here in western North Carolina. They usually carry specialized equipment, but their personnel may be able to perform some advanced skills. Sometimes there are paramedics on those air ambulances or the rescue ambulances, but for the air medical flight teams, they have some skills and equipment that are not available to personnel that are on ground transport units. They also have some more advanced protocols that are beyond what a ground ambulance can actually perform. They are limited, however, by bad weather. Fog, cloud formations, high winds, hail, rain, heavy rains, lightning can all ground or cause these air ambulances to have to terminate their response and return to their base or land at a closer ground facility. They do have the capability of landing just about anywhere that it is deemed safe. So in the event that they do have an emergency situation where they have to get on the ground, they can do so. Whereas fixed wings aircrafts, they're fairly limited to where they can land in an emergency situation. If your EMS system does use a helicopter, obtain a copy of the ground operations procedure. This includes your safety precautions, your landing precautions and considerations. Schedule an orientation session with the helicopter personnel. This is usually done by a training officer or another officer at your agency. So if you are interested in learning more about them, get with that individual. And know how to request a helicopter to respond to your scene, as well as the criteria for calling a helicopter for trauma patients, medical patients, or even a wilderness response. Some key notes to remember is that there's a very select few people who can actually activate the heart team for wilderness responses. So that has to go up your chain of command and go through the appropriate channels before it can be requested to the state emergency management. We as ground responders can't just get on the radio and say, send me a Black Hawk. We actually have to go through our checks and balances before it can be requested. Paramedics, firefighters can go ahead and request helicopters like Mama for medical conditions or patient transports, but that still does also have its procedure and its chain of command as well. So make sure that you're familiar with those procedures before attempting to do so. Okay, on this slide we've got a few examples of some regionally located helicopters that are more common to see in western North Carolina. In the upper left-hand corner, you've got another picture of the UH-60 Black Hawk. This is operated by the National Guard as part of the heart team. They do primarily rescue missions where they'll lift people up into the fuselage or in some instances carry them below. They'll go a short distance, land, and transfer to a medical helicopter. And then directly to the right in the center of your screen with the white background, these are also the top center. This is also operated by the National Guard. It's a Lakota, slightly smaller aircraft used for the same purposes as the Black Hawk. And then in the center of your screen, directly below, this is a helicopter operated by the North Carolina Highway Patrol. And they do the same where they will pick patients up. They cannot take a patient into the aircraft due to its capabilities, so they will carry them a short distance, land nearby, or lower them to a field and transfer them to a either ground transport unit or a medical transport helicopter. Let's go to the bottom left hand where you see this green and white helicopter. This is known as Regional 1. They are based out of Spartanburg, South Carolina, and respond to counties along the state line, Polk County, Henderson County, sometimes Transylvania County, places like that. They are a medical transport helicopter. They are typically staffed with or crewed by a pilot, a flight paramedic, and a flight nurse, and they will actually transport patients directly to the hospital from the scene, though these types of helicopters do not have rescue capabilities. We'll move to the right. You see another green and white helicopter. This is all known as Mama. They are based out of Asheville, North Carolina. There are 3 helicopters in this fleet, 2 exactly like the one you see here. They respond all over western North Carolina, into Tennessee, parts of Georgia, and sometimes Kentucky. We'll move to the right. You see a blue and white helicopter. This is known as Hart, slightly different than the North Carolina Hart team. This one's based out of Elizabethton, Tennessee. This is known as the Highlands Emergency Air Rescue Transport. It is a medical transport helicopter that will respond to the northern portions of North Carolina along the Tennessee border. Moving up to the center right helicopter is another green and white. This is known as Mama 1. This is the newest and largest airframe in the Mama fleet. Slightly larger, has a lot higher capacity with engines than the other Mama helicopter. And again, they respond all over western North Carolina and parts of Tennessee and other adjoining states. And then the last one up here in the top right, this is the same type of helicopter as the Hart and smaller Mama aircraft. They are based out of Pickens, South Carolina. And they respond to parts of western North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina as well. They are also a air medical transport helicopter that does not have rescue capabilities. And of course, there are other helicopters all over that can respond regionally. And if you're in other parts of the state or other states, you'll see different aircrafts. But these are just some of the examples of our more local assets. All right, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So some helicopter and landing zone safety considerations. Helicopters can provide life-saving transport for patients with serious injuries to an appropriate medical facility or from a remote location to another awaiting ground transport unit or a medical helicopter to transport them to a medical facility. They are, however, very dangerous machines to the untrained personnel or a person. The main rotor can spin at around 300 revolutions per minute or RPMs, and sometimes maybe just 4 feet off the ground. The tail rotors spin at more than 3,000 RPMs and may be invisible to an untrained eye. The helicopter pictured here in the bottom right of your screen, is an enclosed tail rotor and is slightly less dangerous, though be it still very dangerous, as opposed to some other air medical helicopters that have an open tail rotor and there is no shroud on the outside of it. This helicopter, this picture, is actually a rear loading. This is the EC-145E Mama helicopter, which is known as Mama 1 now. They load the patient into the rear of the fuselage over here. Other helicopters that have an exposed tail rotor, which is usually or typically sitting off to the side of the tail, those are actually side load helicopters where they actually load into typically the left side or the port side of the aircraft. But since this helicopter is oriented in this direction, I'm pointing at the starboard side. But they typically load them into the port side through the side doors of the aircraft. Prop wash is a thing to consider and be prepared for. They can the rotors can generate winds of about 60 to 80 miles per hour. So it can very easily knock you off balance. When approaching helicopters, we always want to approach them from the nose end, never from their tail, and we want to do it from about 40, at most 45 degree from the nose. So if we're approaching, we want to always actually be able to see the pilot when we're approaching. Before we actually approach the helicopter, we want the pilot to give us a visual cue that it is safe to approach the helicopter and get permission from him. Usually they'll give you a thumbs up or they'll wave you in, something like that. But never just approach a helicopter assuming that it's safe because it's on the ground. So setting up a landing zone, pilots usually land and take off into the wind. The size of the landing zone depends on the size of the helicopter. Typically, for most civilian helicopters, we're looking for an area of at least 100 by 100 feet, which is about 10,000 square feet. Most of your larger military aircraft, like the UH-60 or the Black Hawk used for the Heart team, during the daytime really requires about 100 by 200 foot landing zone, and then at nighttime, even a 200 by 200. And for safety precautions, you can really use this same format for civilian helicopters. At night, you can consider or just go ahead and assume that it's going to be safer or more advantageous to provide a larger, slightly larger than daytime sized landing zone. So you could go 100 to 150 or 100 by 200 at night as well. But these larger aircrafts really do need that larger space, especially when we're dealing with the civilian setting. In military operations, they'll do what they want to do. And most helicopter pilots will land where they feel comfortable and will wave off areas that they don't feel comfortable with. Landing zones should be typically as flat as possible. The average, for civilian aircraft, the steepest pitch is around 5 degrees. Most civilian pilots will be kind of uncomfortable-ish around a 4-degree pitch. But that 5 degrees of pitch on your terrain is typically the no landing zone, and they won't want to land there. So typically perfectly flat, 0 to 3 degrees is perfectly fine. 4 degrees is getting a little, and then that 5 degree or above. A lot of military aircraft, their typical operation or safety zone is around 7-ish degrees. But when we're looking at the terrain, we kind of want to take that into consideration as well. They're not going to be landing on the side of a hill for us. But other things we want to consider is we want the ground to be clear and free of loose debris, tarps, blankets, things that could possibly get sucked up into the prop wash or get blown off into vehicles or personnel. We also want to keep in mind, if you'll take a look at this picture down here, some overhead hazards. So in the very background here, we have some tall pine trees and some other hardwood trees that we want to take into consideration. As you can see here behind my pointer, we've got a couple pairs of overhead power lines. These are running roughly east to west in this picture. Off this picture, there's also a pair of set of power lines running north to south. That creates a kind of a quadrant for this landing zone. And then over here on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see this little tower, this little weather station tower. That's about, by recollection, I think it was about 35 feet tall. But it was outside of that 100 by 100 safety zone. This landing zone actually wound up being about 175 by 250 feet. So we had plenty of room. Now to also take into consideration, the pitch of this terrain was actually about 4 degrees. So we were right on the cusp of that comfortability level. And then you can see this one rescue vehicle or command vehicle up here at the nose of the aircraft. So with the wind coming in the right direction, which this particular photo was taken when there was no wind at all, the command on the ground will tell the pilot or the air crew, this is the item or the object of the vehicle that you want to line up with. This is going to be the nose of your aircraft. So taking that in consideration as well, if you're going to take that approach, you might want to consider, is there wind? Where's the sun at? Do we want the helicopter landing with the sun directly in the pilot's eyes or what have you? So we want to orient our LZ as appropriately as possible. And then, of course, the pilot has the ultimate say-so, and the crew with the pilot. So if they don't like something on the ground, they may opt to alter that landing zone a little bit as well, or the orientation of the aircraft. Typically, we want to inform any kind of bystanders that we are closing this area down to perform an LZ or set up an LZ landing zone for an incoming helicopter. And then, of course, we want to cordon off or mark off our landing zone. Typically want to avoid using flags or traffic cones or other things that could be blown away, because they become those same hazards like blankets or sheets or tarps. Fusees or signal flares can create a fire hazard, especially in really dry conditions. And then you have the excess wind from the helicopter can accelerate any flames or fires that get started, and typically should not be used. When we're using our flashing emergency lights, we want to decrease the amount of those lights that we're using. So the white lights and a lot of flashing LED lights can really interfere with the pilot's visualization. So, turning on your secondary lights, or as minimal of lights as possible at night, they can be used for a distance visual reference. During the day, it's not such a problem with visual impairment, but we want to decrease the amount of lights that we're actually using to mark our landing zone. A lot of times, you'll take a command vehicle and put it on one side of the landing zone, and another vehicle place that at the opposite end of the landing zone to kind of cordon that off. And then, of course, keep any vehicles or any bystanders outside. Close the windows and doors of any nearby vehicles. Little side story, I had a helicopter land one time, and it was very wet on the ground. And after joking around with the pilot for a few minutes, they got back in their aircraft, took off, and before they were too far away, they spun around because the back doors of our ambulance was still open, and they completely saturated everything in the back of the ambulance. So that was intentional, but accidental things like that can occur. Some helicopter services request that there be a charged fire hose or charged line be available just in case there is a fire emergency. So be familiar with that before you start setting up landing zones as well. Some departments also have their own departmental policies regarding that in addition. So loading patients into the helicopter. Secure all the loose clothing, sheets, and instruments. Anything that's not necessary stays away from the helicopter. Use eye protection to prevent debris from getting into your eyes. Approach the helicopter from the front only after the pilot or a crew member tells you that it's okay, and follow the commands of the flight crew. They're the ones that are trained specifically on this aircraft. They know the safety procedures and precautions. Give the patient report to the crew. This typically happens in the back of the ambulance, where it's not as loud or so loud as the outside and near the helicopter. Offer your assistance to the crew. Use this time when you're handing over patient care to package the patient and get them prepped for transferring to the helicopter. If you will be working with a helicopter, ambulance, or air ambulance, arrange an orientation session with the helicopter personnel. They're usually very happy to do this for agencies. It's just taking the time to schedule it and work out all those little thorny details. And here actually this is Sky Life air medical helicopter, but this is an example of that side loading helicopter. You can see here where the port side doors open and kind of like in a sequential fashion, and the patient actually gets slid into the fuselage from the side. This aircraft is going to have an open tail rotor back here. So typically you will approach from that front quarter or directly from the front, come around the aircraft, and then enter from the side. Okay, to summarize up this chapter, as an EMR, you need proper equipment on an emergency call, including medical equipment in your life support kit, your personal safety equipment, and to safeguard yourself and others at an accident scene. There are 6 phases of an emergency call and the preparation. These are dispatch, response, arrival, transfer of patient to other EMS personnel, and then your post-run activities. If you will be working with an air ambulance or medical helicopter, you need to know the proper safety procedures and precautions, loading procedures, and helicopter patient transfer procedure as well. And we have some questions to review this chapter. Question 1, which of the following is not a phase of an emergency medical responder call? Arrival at scene, the post-run activities, scheduling for upcoming shifts, or preparation. And of course, that's scheduling for upcoming shifts. That's going to be one of your officers at your department is going to schedule your shifts. Question 2, information from dispatch should include all of the following except. Is it A, the number of patients, B, the nature of call, C, the nearest hospital, or D, callback number or telephone number to reach the original caller? The answer is going to be the nearest hospital. This is something that the ambulance crew or even first responders really should know, just from being familiar with the area that they're responding in. And then question 3, when approaching a helicopter, you should always approach from the rear. B, always approach from the front. C, attempt to move the patient to the aircraft as soon as it lands. Or D, not need eye protection, or you do not need eye protection. And the correct answer is going to be B, always approach the aircraft from the front and after being signaled that it is safe to do so by one of the flight crew, ideally the pilot. Okay, so this is all I have for you for transport operations of Chapter 19. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me or drop a direct message, private message into the class chat. Our next chapter will be Chapter 20, where we'll be going over vehicle extrication. There's learning objectives for Chapter 19. Those are good study points. You'll find those in your My Courses page, and review your chapter, of course, in your textbook, and reference any of your other learning resources on your My Courses page. All right, thank you very much. We'll see you next go-round.